What sort of book is the Bible? When we read the Bible, we are struck by the different type of material within it. There's history, there's song, there's law, there's ritual, and there are a vast variety of other sorts of material within the text. And yet, we treat it as a single book. What is it that gives it its unity? I think as Christians, one of the answers we would want to give is its testimony to Christ. It is a book about Him. And so when we're reading the Bible, we read it Christologically. And we often talk this way. It's a book about Christ. And yet, what does it mean to say that Scripture should be read Christologically? How do you read a book in the light of a person? There are many different answers that we could give. Perhaps one of the most natural answers is to think about biblical prophecy. Throughout the Old Testament, there are various prophecies of a one who is to come. There is the prophet like Moses. There is the Elijah that is to come. There is the greater son of David. And all these other figures that seem to point forward to one who we would identify with Jesus Christ. And yet, there is much that does not seem to account for. A lot of biblical material that might not explain. And so when we're reading the Bible, maybe we need a deeper account of what it means to read Christologically. In the New Testament, we have several examples where Jesus speaks to his disciples about how to read the Old Testament. Now, unfortunately, we were not given the full information of the conversation on the way to Emmaus, where Christ opened the Scriptures to the two disciples on that journey, and their hearts burned within them. And yet we're told that he told them all these things in the Scriptures concerning himself. All the things in the law, in the prophets, in the Psalms, and in the other sorts of material in the Scripture that points finally to him. Now, when we're reading the Scripture, we can often try and piece together what that sort of conversation would have involved. Or when Jesus spoke to his disciples and opened their understanding to perceive in the Scriptures the things concerning himself after the resurrection. We imagine the conversation and we go back and we read the text and we see, for instance, in the story of Joseph, the man placed in the pit and then raised up later, the man with two thieves by his side, the man who is raised to the height of power and then provides for his people. We can think of the story of David, his exile from Jerusalem during the coup of Absalom, and the way in which his journey, weeping as he ascends the Mount of Olives, is an anticipation of Christ's own journey away from Jerusalem as he goes towards his death. Or we might think about Daniel in the lion's den. We might think about the way that Moses leads his people across the sea in the Exodus and leads them to the mount where they receive the law as he ascends on high. All of these things can be seen as anticipations of Christ. And of course, in the New Testament, the story of the Gospels and the story of the book of Acts is told in a way that alludes to these previous events. Christ is fulfilling not just Old Testament prophecy, but Old Testament types. And so this is another example of what it means to read the Bible Christologically. Christological reading is to see the analogies and the types of the Old Testament fulfilled in the New. Now, how do we piece all this together? How do we find unity in these different ways of reading the text and maybe get purchase upon the whole thing as a united witness to Christ? I think it can be helpful to step back and think about how deep and elaborate the connection between the Old and New Testaments is when looking at a text such as 1 Corinthians chapter 10. At the beginning of that, Paul talks about all our fathers having passed through the cloud and the sea, and thereby being baptized into Moses. He's drawing an analogy between the experience of Old Testament Israel and the experience of the church. One baptized into Moses, the other baptized into Christ. And he's going further than that. He's describing Old Testament Israel as our fathers, even of Gentile Christians in the city of Corinth. There is a continuity there that we can see in the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants, our family history. And then beyond that, there's an analogy, a homology between the experience of Israel in the wilderness and the experience of the church. They were baptized into Moses. We are baptized into Christ. They ate the same spiritual food and drink, and we eat the same spiritual food and drink, a point that Paul will go on to explore later in that passage and in the chapter that follows. He goes further. He talks about the way that Christ was present in the wilderness. Christ was indeed the rock that followed them. Christ was not pleased with them and judged them on account of their blaspheming against him. And so Christ was present, even if incognito, in the wilderness experience. Maybe we're supposed to see Christ in the angel of the covenant mentioned in Exodus chapter 23, verse 20. Or maybe we're supposed to see the way in which the Lord was present before Moses as he struck the rock as an identification between God and the rock, and more particularly between Christ and that rock. Beyond that, Paul goes on to talk about how these things happened as examples for us upon whom the end of the ages has come. And so on these different levels, there's a deep connection between the Old and New Testaments. There is a similarity between the experience that we have and the experience of the Old Testament saints. There is a continuity between the two. There is an exemplary character of the Old Testament story for Christians today. And then there are all these other ways in which Christ is present within that story that represents a commonality of experience of Old Testament believers and New Testament Christians. And so this deep connection suggests that Paul was reading the Old Testament story Christologically, seeing Christ within that account on all those different levels, as one who is prefigured by the narrative, as one to whom the narrative leads, as one who was present in that narrative, and as someone who fulfills the examples of that narrative. And as we read that narrative, we have examples as people who are following Christ.